Today we are talking The Outlaws with the great Stephen Merchant on the Film Threat podcast. I'm Alan Ning. I'm the editor-in-chief of Film Threat, and today on the Film Threat podcast, we have an amazing guest. He's the co-creator of The Office, starred in The Tooth Fairy. Hello, ladies. We got that one. Fighting with My Family. He wrote and directed that one. We've got the great Stephen Merchant to talk about his television series now on Amazon Prime. Yeah, just real quick before we begin, be sure to support Film Threat as we support independent films. The best way you can do that is if you're watching this on YouTube, hit that like, subscribe, please comment away. Also, if you want to help us in other ways, you can go to our merch shop, the Film Threat shop at shop.filmthreat.com. Pick up a mug, some amazing t-shirts. We've got everything for you to love and enjoy and embrace and put on your bodies, because Film Threat t-shirts, they cure nudity. All right, so like I said, we've got Stephen Merchant coming up. We talked about, I just talked to him, so we talked about not only the series, but what it was like working with Christopher Walken. He's got some incredible advice for emerging filmmakers like yourselves. And we talk about the creative process, especially partnerships. We talk a little bit about Ricky Gervais and Elgin James, we co-created The Outlaws with. So let's just get to it. Hey, thanks so much for doing this. I appreciate you talking with me.
Of course, a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So I've done my research. I've seen every interview you've done, at least on YouTube, for The Outlaws. And so I feel like you're probably on the tail end of publicity. So I'm trying to ask some questions you've not been told. And I kind of want to explore the creative process. So for The Outlaws, I would say it's a fairly standard comedic gimmick where you have a kind of a band of misfits who have to work out their differences and work together. And you're kind of bringing also in an aspect of your parents' life as one who oversaw community service workers. My question is I guess the point I want to make is, you're taking a comedy trope, and I feel like your series is more of a drama and a thriller than it is a comedy. Would you agree with that? And kind of how did it evolve from that?
Well, I think that a lot of my favorite films and TV have always combined humor with often genre tropes. So I think of things like Alfred Hitchcock movies, many of which are very suspenseful, obviously, but which have a lot of humor in them, whether it's North by Northwest or, lots of the other ones. And that's also true of Billy Wilder films, where he took genre and often, again, there was an injection of humor. In fact, a lot of film noir, I think, Philip Marlowe, as played by Humphrey Bogart, or William Powell, lots of kind of humor, sort of sharp one-liners. And coming up more recently, things like Midnight Run in the 80s, and I think even sort of The Sopranos, for instance, had a lot of humor, dark humor in the show. So I've always liked that idea of sort of genre stuff that can inject itself with a bit of humor. And like you say, I don't think we were setting out to make a pure comedy by any means. We just wanted the show to sort of be what it needs to be at whatever point. So during the thrillery moments, hopefully it feels tense or suspenseful, and we're not trying to undercut it. It's not a satire, it's not a spoof. But equally, in the sort of lighter moments, we can have some jokes and one-liners, even an occasional bit of physical comedy, and just hopefully try and pull those styles together. I mean, whether we succeed is up to you, but I think that was the ambition. Mm-hmm. And like you say, I think, the very fact that the show is called The Outlaws, the music has a slightly kind of movie Western feel to it, is all, in a sense, I always like the idea of, as you mentioned, the kind of misfit group that pulled together. I was thinking of like the Magnificent Seven. We have 7 characters as well, who sort of, but they're not as glamorous as, Steve McQueen on a horse. They're kind of provincial British people in a small town, and sort of trying to give their lives a grandeur and a sort of status that they don't really deserve as people.
Yeah, so I guess from there, you have kind of a seed of an idea, and I think there is, if I were to guess, there is that comedy element that is ingrained in that seed. How did it evolve into what it is in the final product?
Well, I was here in Los Angeles and I was asking my agents, I said, I'd love to introduce me to some other writers who come from a very different walk of life to me, have a different life story, just very different background. There's someone who's on the other side of the tracks, as it were, or certainly growing up. And they introduced me to this guy called Elgin James, who your readers and viewers may know from Mayans MC, which he's co-created with Kurt Sutter. And I met with Elgin, and we are from very different backgrounds. And, Elgin, as I'm sure he would tell you himself, ran with gangs when he was growing up and had a much more tough upbringing than me, even spent some time in jail. And yeah, he's a very sweet guy. And we hit it off immediately and we had a lot in common. And I think when writers meet, they often spend as much time talking about the things that they dislike as much as the things they like. So we sort of drew up our hate list of things. And we hit it off. And I talked to him about this idea, just this idea of sort of people doing community service. As you mentioned, it originated because my parents used to be involved with that world. And they would tell me about the sort of unlikely people that came through the door. And it might have been like a businessman who was doing a DUI or an old guy who'd been stealing from people's gardens. There was an old guy who'd stole cabbages and other vegetables from people's gardens. And he would come back year after year. And my mother realized he just liked the social aspect of community service, which I thought was quite tragic and sweet. So I just mentioned this to Elgin. Don't you think that would be an interesting backdrop for something, all these different people? And he liked that idea, but it felt like it was a way into a crime story that wasn't about police or gangsters in the more obvious sense, and that we were sort of coming into a crime thriller through the back door, if you like. And anyway, we hit it off, and we developed it together.
Yeah, was he more of a sounding board, or was he pretty heavily involved in the development of the Outlaws?
Oh no, it was very much a co-developed, co-written project. It began life as a movie, and we wrote it initially as a movie script. But as you mentioned, because there's so many characters, it was a bit unwieldy as a film. There's too many people to focus on. You couldn't give enough airtime, screen time to each of the characters. So after a while, we realized, this is probably better suited as a TV show, because we can kind of explore each of the people in more depth. And the hope was to sort of start them as archetypes, as familiar character types, and then try and sort of unpack them and peel back the layers as the show developed, so that you began to get a great understanding of what led them to that place. Okay,
so our audience is mostly independent filmmakers and people who want to kind of get into the business and break into it. And so I'm going to ask you the only Ricky question here. And I kind of want to go at it from a partnership aspect of it, and from a creative partnership aspect. I think from what I've read about you, he started off kind of as a mentor relationship, but I assume it grew into more of a creative relationship. So I'm wondering, what is it about having a partner, whether it's Ricky or whether it's Elgin, that you look for? What are the qualities you look for as a creative partner?
Well, in the case of Ricky, we met at a radio station, and he was already working there, and he hired me as his assistant. When you say a mentor relationship, I think it's an interesting one, because I think in some instances that's right, because he was older than me, and at times he felt it was like an older brother who offered good advice. But at other times he was almost like an irresponsible child that I was sort of parenting. And so it became a kind of odd relationship where we would shift positions, in a sense, back and forth, depending on sort of what we were doing in any given moment. And but certainly, again, like with Elgin, we very quickly hit it off. I'd say similar sense of humor, similar likes and dislikes. A lot of the initial sort of partnering was just talking, discovering the things that you like, the common interests you have, the shared love of whatever it might be. And then it's just, I suppose any good creative partnership begins with that, begins with the seeds of a friendship, of a feeling of creative trust, of feeling that anything's on the table. There are no sort of limits. You shouldn't police yourself. I think you have to feel a trust with the other person. You have to feel like you can share stories from your life that could be embarrassing or intimate. Because I think if you try and put up walls or try and present yourself in a certain way, you're not You're never going to speak honestly about things, and so much of any good writing partnership is about sharing life stories, sharing anecdotes, honesty, and I find it very hard, or I should say, I find it much easier to partner with someone or a group of people when doing any kind of project. As you say, partly because it's a sounding board, but also it just feels like you make progress quicker. As anyone who's ever sat down to write a script or a screenplay knows, you're staring at a blank page, and you, in a sense, have endless opportunities to go in any direction. And any moment where you reach a moment, you've got a myriad of choices, right, to go. You could take the characters in any direction, and it's very hard to pick your way through that. Whereas if you have a partner or partners, you just get to you just answer things so much quicker because you just talk them through, boom, 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 and you feel like you cross off all the routes you don't want to take, and it directs you towards the one you do. And so for me, it's the most enjoyable way to work. You feel a little bit more secure because you feel like if you pitch an idea and the other person responds to it, or you pitch a joke and they laugh, it just gets you down the line quicker.
Yeah. I have to imagine there's the yes and to it as well. It's, you've got these ideas flowing, and then the other person is adding to that now and just spurring on the momentum, so to speak.
Absolutely. And that's not to say, of course, that you don't run into brick walls, and you don't. I mean, there are many hours spent with Ricky where we were just sort of staring at each other and not figuring out where to go next. But once someone says something and it sparks an idea, as you say, then it just starts flowing. And it's like you're saying about the yes and, the kind of improv feel. It's just the person is building on the other person's idea. And, I mean, the most joyous example of that was when I went to the Office writer's room, the US version of the Office. Mm-hmm. And that writer's room was so creative, so many smart, funny people. And just seeing the kind of the nub of an idea ping around that room like a pinball and grow into something clever and smart and interesting. And that's really, really fun. And it's not that you can't do it on your own. It's just going to take longer. Yeah. And so why not make it easier for yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I would imagine I'd like to think that also in a relationship, there's that yin yang aspect of it where something great comes out of butting heads, so to speak. Is that something that you particularly find enjoyable or creatively spurs you on creatively, or is it best not to? I guess I'm trying to figure out kind of. I always feel like conflict has its place in creativity. Maybe that's the best way to say it.
Well, I think you're right to a degree. Although I think what needs to be removed from it is ego. I think that ego is detrimental to creativity, because I don't think you're coming. If the decision you're making is because if you don't want to back down because you're embarrassed or you feel like it means you've lost, or if you're on set and the reason you don't want to wear that particular costume is because, as an actor, is because it makes you look fat, then that's vanity and that's ego and that's getting in the way of storytelling, and it's getting in the way of what's best for the project. And I think for me, the best idea for the project is what needs to always win. And so, I do writers' rooms now where I'm perhaps the more senior writer, but hopefully people would say that I'm quite egoless. I don't try and dictate, I don't try and mandate that it has to be my way or the highway. It's just that ultimately someone has to have the final say, and so that would be me. But the best idea always wins. And if an idea is not quite firing, we go back and we work it again. And so there is sort of, heads can butt, and you can clash with someone over an idea, or you can argue it back and forth. But I think it should always just be sort of respectful, creative discussion. I think as soon as it gets antagonistic, that's normally because there's ego involved, because otherwise there's no reason to be in an argument. It should just be a creative discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone wants to feel like they put their mark on it, and sometimes it just doesn't fit. Yeah. So then let me ask you. So the Outlaws, the thing that struck me is not only are there 7 characters in this, that's a lot, but I think and also being the band of misfits, there's that diversity of characters, and I always feel like I'll take the two characters, it's John and Myrna. Politically they're on the polar opposites of the spectrum here. But what I appreciate most about the show is that you've made these people incredibly flawed. They've got characteristics within them that they're hiding, and I always feel like, well, that's the best thing to do, because that's what we relate to. We're not perfect people on social media. We have our deep secrets. Can you talk about the character development and that aspect of, you've got these tropes, so to speak, the stereotypes, and then how you approach it as you were creating the Outlaws?
Elgin and I were developing this during a time when Trump was on the rise here in the US. In the UK, Brexit was bubbling away, and people felt very socially and politically divided, it seemed to me. And it felt like through social media, through the media generally, people were becoming stereotypes, right? So there was the right winger and the left winger, there was the pro-Brexit, the anti-Brexit, and everyone was being homogenized into one group or the other. And it seemed odd to us that surely not everybody who is pro-Trump agrees with everything else that every other pro-Trump person agrees with. There must be confusion and division even within the pro-Trump group or the anti-Trump group. And so the discussion, of course, which is an obvious one, is that everybody's unique. Everybody has led their way or found their way to their status in life, their political beliefs, their social beliefs. They've got there through some reason. They didn't just land in a pod and those are their beliefs they have. And so to us, what was interesting was, well, what if you take what on the surface is a very clean cut sort of right wing, successful middle-aged businessman with a certain set of beliefs, and you see the kind of person that you'd see portrayed all over the place in media, on TV. But what happens if you dig beneath that and you find out why do they have the views they have? What has led them to that place? Can you make people that don't share those views empathize with them? And that seemed interesting, and to do that on the left as well, and to do that with young and old and all these different sort of social groups, and try and present the kind of the archetype, the person that perhaps you would dismiss if you met them in the street or saw them on social media. And what if you got to know them, would your opinion change? And that seemed, I don't know, that seemed like an interesting idea, and it seemed like a quite a utopian, hopeful idea, that if you got to know people, you may not share their beliefs, but perhaps you'd understand them more and you'd empathize with them more. And I don't know, on a kind of grander level, that seems like that's the only way forward socially, right? The only way that anyone can kind of ultimately move things forward is finding common ground and sort of finding the things which unite them. And I know that might seem a rather sort of pedestrian idea, but I mean, but it needs to happen.
Yeah.
And so and so that was sort of the jumping off point. But that makes it sound like, we had a kind of mission. Ultimately, we didn't. We were just interested in exploring these kinds of characters and like I say, peeling back the layers.
Is there kind of a dance in terms of trying to sell that? I mean, it's weird. It's like, this seems all common sense. It seems like this is, the best way to approach storytelling to kind of reach a broad audience. And I feel like nowadays, maybe it's much more difficult in the States than it is in the UK. Do you think we're losing the ability to tell stories like this anymore?
Well, I don't like the idea of knowing explicitly what the political agenda of a piece of art is. I always think it's interesting if I don't quite know where they're coming from. A good example of that is the comedian Bill Burr, who I think is absolutely brilliant, but I'm not sure I know what his politics are.
Yeah.
He's like an equal opportunities offender. He kind of upsets everybody. And I think that's really clever. I think that's interesting because it's provocative in a way that it's challenging, and you can agree with him at times, and then you can be shocked. And that dance is really interesting. And I like the idea of that with our show, and that we were trying to sort of reflect something socially, but we weren't trying to pin our colors to the mast and say, this is what we think is right. And of course, there's, broadly speaking, that's obvious, but we were trying to just, I don't know, to try and kind of create a selection of characters that you wouldn't necessarily like and agree with all of them, but perhaps you could begin to empathize with them, and that you could come from any position as a viewer and you could kind of be challenged in different ways, and that seemed more interesting than just sort of sticking a flag in the sand and saying this is what we believe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it destroys storytelling in a way. If you know, to me, stories has always been about people, and it's and I think that's what I appreciate most about it is we are all flawed. We all have the problems with us, and those problems, when exposed, just leads to comedy, and I think that's what you're doing here. So,
Absolutely.
Okay, so here's my Christopher Walken question. So you cast him. He read the script. He liked it. You met him, and he agrees to do it. Did you have to change much to the script now to fit? Now that you have him, to fit him, his character, his history, his legacy?
We always wanted a character in the show that felt sort of alien, felt like a man who'd fell to earth, that didn't quite belong in this world, that on the surface seemed a little bit exotic and almost glamorous. And so we wanted an American actor, for instance, in this British setting. And there were sort of actors that we talked about, and Christopher Walken was sort of at the top of the list, and miraculously, as you say, he agreed to do it. But the character had sort of already been written as a sort of an American kind of huckster, low-level con man, sort of petty criminal, and we'd always written him with a certain kind of like a turn of phrase that felt like he'd grown up in kind of jazz clubs in the 60s, that he sort of had slightly kind of hep cat phrases, what's ticking chicken and things like that. And so that was already there. And then we sent it to Christopher. And the thing with Christopher is that once he's read the script and he agrees to it, he does not want you to change a word. He starts to learn the script, and he's, by his own admission, he finds it difficult to learn lines, as I do, and so he doesn't let you change the script. So after he's read it and he's agreed to do it, that's sort of the character's kind of locked and loaded, really. So what he brings to it is his unique speech patterns and his, dramatic emphasis or comic emphasis or whatever. But in terms of the script, he encourages you not to sort of Walkenize it, as he says.
Yeah, no, you brought up something that I find interesting, but I think as creators here in the States looking at England and British actors, and when you say we wanted to bring this kind of American character, is it a lot about how the Brits think of Americans, or is the way you created it, or is it just a specific type? I just find that this idea fascinating.
Well, I think what's interesting, isn't it, is that whatever side of the Atlantic you are, someone from the other side seems a little bit more exotic or perhaps even glamorous, right? And so that was what was interesting, at least for our British audience, was the idea of someone like Christopher Walken showing up in a kind of provincial town in England, bringing the star power that he does add a kind of charge to the show. But which is one that you can also then start to unpack, right? So again, what I liked about using Christopher was that to a British audience, for instance, he seems exotic, glamorous. You've seen him in these amazing movies. He carries with him that weight of kind of playing gangsters and tough guys and mobsters, and the idea of sort of that person arriving with that baggage and that not being who this person is, this person being kind of a sort of weaselly character who's like walked out on his family and has cheated people and has gone to prison for petty crimes, and just reduce him to this sort of this loser status in a way, seemed again to go back to our idea of taking a trope and then kind of unpacking it. Because I often think that when I watch American gangster movies about New York mobsters, they seem very glamorous. But when you read about them in real life, they're not glamorous, are they? I mean, they're sort of they're squabbling among each other. They're sort of grubby people doing kind of, malevolent things. There is no glamour to them. Just because they wear a silk suit doesn't make them glamorous. They're still sort of squalid people with blood on their hands often. And it's interesting, that idea. And I don't know whether Americans look at mobsters with the same eye, whether they look at them and think, "Oh, they seem very exotic and glamorous."
Well, I mean,
I don't know. What,
yeah, Sopranos is a great example of that.
There you go. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So last question. Let's see. So this is kind of a general, broad question, but you've met someone who has their script in hand. They've worked on it 2 years. They feel like they're ready to go. What piece of advice would you give them?
I think the first thing is have it read out loud. Get a group of people into a room. It doesn't have to be professional actors, but obviously if you have any actor friends or anyone who aspires to be an actor, that's great. Get them in a room and let them read it out loud. Someone reads the stage directions, the actors, however many you've got, they double up if you don't have enough people, but they read the script out loud, because it tells you immediately several things. If it's trying to be funny and no one laughs, that's not a good sign. It tells you about clarity and coherence. Does the story make sense? Are people following it? Are people bored? Again, if you can have a small audience, that obviously helps. You can feel it in the room when it's not quite landing. Even if there's only a handful of people, it's the same with a test screening of something. You can feel when the audience is restless, or it's just like it's in the air. And you can learn so much from that. So it tells you about clarity. It tells you about pace. Are scenes running too long? Are they outstaying their welcome? Are they saying the same thing twice? And structurally, are the climaxes happening where you want them to? Are the sort of emotional beats falling in the right place? It just tells you so much. And there's a way of hearing it when it's out loud that is so much different than reading. It'll never be the same when you read it. There's something about when it's said out loud that has an impact and tells you a lot. So I think that is a great place to start. And then, of course, nowadays with the advent of iPhones with extraordinary cameras on them, editing software, online, if there's any way that you can shoot any of it, whether it's a taster scene, depending on how much scale your project has, but if there's any of it which could be rendered on screen, brought to life, maybe a scene, maybe a fake trailer, maybe a couple of scenes, anything that can kind of animate it into life, I think helps, because I think producers, me included, are lazy. It's a bit of a chore to read a 90-page script. I don't care how good your script is. I don't like reading scripts. I just find that I don't like the format. I wish it was written like a short story. I don't know why it has to be written the way it is. I find it very frustrating to read. I can't keep track of who everybody is. Is Jeff the Jeff we met at the beginning? I don't remember. So anything I think which can kind of, obviously the script's ultimately going to be the blueprint, but anything else that can kind of animate it and bring it to life. I've seen great things where people have made fake trailers. I mean, in fact, I did one for the Outlaws early days, where I just cut together clips from all kinds of things. I cast the show with existing actors and pulled clips from things, and just to give a feel of sort of what I wanted the spirit of the thing to be, the music, the sort of energy of it, the log line, if you like, of the 7 characters meeting. Anything you can do, I think, and you can do so much of this on your computer, just to sort of to animate it, to bring it to life, to give your script personality, I think it is invaluable. I mean, there was a guy I remember years ago called David Earl who sent us, when I was working with Ricky initially, he sent a tape in to our agents. And our agent said, "Oh, you should take a look at this." And he had shot himself this little sort of 20-minute film of him as this eccentric character who was looking, I think, for the Loch Ness Monster. And he sort of shot himself. And it was so funny and so unique and so kind of quirky that we met with with David. And we've used him, both of us have used him throughout our careers, in different capacities, in different projects. And again, if we had read the script of that, even if you'd read the original script of The Office, I think you'd have been like, and then Ricky Gervais looks at the camera and rolls his eyes, and that would be funny. Like, it's bringing it to life, as we did with it. We did a little sort of demo version of The Office early on. I just think that's a great way of just cutting through to an audience.
Yeah, I mean,
more
honestly,
directly.
I could, I see a lot of independent films, and I do see that whether they've, whether it's kind of like whether the creator holds on to his work too much and is almost afraid of hearing it out loud and worse yet, being able to take some criticism about it. You've got to do
but
that.
That's the problem. This is what I said before. But as we said at the beginning, it's about ego. You've got to put your ego to one side. I always think now that the arrogance that Ricky and I had to write and direct and act in the original version of The Office is absurd. And the reason we had that arrogance was because we didn't know what the hell we were talking about. And it's only when you've done it a lot of times that you realize how much you didn't know when you started. And so for young aspiring filmmakers, you're the same as I was. You think you just think, I've seen enough YouTube, videos about directing. I've read the books. I've listened to the podcasts and the commentaries on DVDs. I know how to direct. And you may be brilliant, but what you don't know, what you haven't experienced, is the sheer minute by minute mechanics of directing something. It is exhausting. You do not have endless resources and money, so that is tying your hands. It's very limiting. It's the weather changes, the actors are difficult, the actors don't show up, someone drops out, you lose the location. There are so many other things which are making it hard for you over and above your brilliant piece of work, right? So you're not just sat there with sort of just deciding, I think I'll move the camera here. All the toys you want, the cranes, the drones, the track, maybe you can't afford it. There's all these limitations that you have. And I remember I think it's Kurosawa who was asked once, someone said, I noticed the amazing mise-en-scène of this frame, with the leaves there and the tree there. Why did you frame it that way? And he said something like, well, because if you went an inch that way, there was a gas station, and an inch that way, there was an apartment building. And it's like so much of the creative choices you end up making are because of limitations, because of difficulties. And so, again, the reason I bring that up is because it's the stuff you just don't know until you've done something. And it's also why you need to be as primed beforehand, as armed with as much information ahead of time, so that you are ready to go when all those problems are rising. And that's why you need that script watertight. You need to have heard it out loud. You need to know the scenes you don't need, the scenes you can cut out, the scenes you can afford to lose, the beats that are just things you're really keen on, but actually aren't essential to the story. All that stuff, all that forewarned information is going to make it easier for you when you get there. And that's the stuff you tend to learn when you've done it a few times.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate it. You've been very generous with your time, and I'm grateful for that. So The Outlaws season 1 is on Amazon Prime here in the States. I understand season 2 is already in the books as well. Already been shot.
Season 2 was already filmed. A great example of what I was just saying. We got 10 days into filming the first season. COVID struck. We had to shut down. I was twiddling my thumbs. I said to Amazon, can I just write a second season while we're downing tools? And they were like, okay. So we came back and did 2 seasons back to back. And it goes to exactly what I was just saying. It was incredibly difficult. It was really, really hard to shoot under COVID, to do 2 seasons back to back. And all of the difficulties that I just explained were there tenfold. But because the scripts were tight, we'd read them out loud, we had had readings, we had refined them. That was the thing we kept clinging on to, So yes, 2 seasons already in the can.
Okay. And is there a season 3 promised, or are we too early for that?
We've started talking about ideas for a season 3,
okay.
And I guess it will be about whether audiences enjoy it enough. They seem to have liked it enormously in the UK, so I hope US audiences will feel the same way.
Yeah, hope so too. All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate you being with me.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Great talking to you.